back to Block TV, where it is time for cryptonomics. And today, if the race for CBDC is on, and the United States is definitely not playing, as stated by its Secretary of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, in remarks he made at a House Financial Committee in Washington, D.C. late last week. Now, Mnuchin didn't stop there, weighed in on other hot potato topics in the cryptosphere. And for more on that, I'm joined by Block TV senior correspondent Asha Wetrup-Evans. Yes, the administration in the United States has spoken.
Yeah, and they are not in a rush, Yael. My gosh, they are not interested in heading towards the CBDC route, taking up distinct action on that, despite the actions by other central banks around the world, including in China, the European Central Bank, the Banque de France, the Central Bank of China, and others. But let's hear firstly from Mnuchin himself, in his own words, what his views were on a CBDC.
I would differentiate what China is doing from what a Bitcoin or a Facebook would do. What China is doing is really issuing digital currency in lieu of physical cash, and they can track all that. So they will be able to track where that goes. That's different than a Bitcoin. It's no different than in the U.S. if money is sent on the Fed wire system. It can be tracked, and money through SWIFT has identifiers. So again, I would differentiate kind of what central banks are doing from what a Libra or a Bitcoin is doing. As it relates to the Fed, and Chair Powell and I have discussed this at length, I think we both agree for the near future, in the next 5 years, we see no need for the Fed to issue digital currency. And that's because, again, we have a very sophisticated system. The Fed is working on electronic payment system. We need to make sure they're real-time electronic payment system in the U.S. But thank you for your concern.
Okay, wait. So they have a very sophisticated system. Let's break down that.
Look, I mean, it is sophisticated. It's just archaic.
Exactly. I mean, I think it was sophisticated. One can argue to the end of the last century.
Perhaps so, exactly. Okay. So, look, interesting takeaways from that statement that I see him saying that both he and the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell agree that nothing should be done within the next 5 years. That
and that's interesting that they actually quantified it for the next 5 years.
Right, giving a fairly set time frame out there, which is interesting. But he did say the Fed is working on a real-time electronic payment system, which I suppose ostensibly would resolve the issue if they would develop it. It's interesting, though, because I feel, and many in the sphere would say, that cryptocurrencies do resolve that issue. It's a system that's there, that is being tested in real time by private and decentralized institutions around the world.
For a decade now.
So why not use the one that exists? Right. Why take a stance against it? I don't know if he's... I mean, look, the one positive to say to really take out of this in terms of cryptocurrencies and the space is that he's starting to distinguish. The conversation is getting more nuanced than simply...
You're getting educated.
Exactly. Okay. There is clearly education there. I mean, even him pointing out the distinctions between Bitcoin, between Libra, between a central bank digital currency.
Exactly.
So those distinctions are coming into government conversation more and more. And when the Treasury Secretary is speaking about that, it is a positive, even if they're not looking at implementing their own CBDC, which, well, the consequences, I guess, we'll have to see play out in real time.
Play out in real time, and it'll be interesting to see if they say the same thing once the Chinese CBDC is launched.
Right, that could really change
maybe
the
they'll change them just because the tone of Mnuchin tends to change, as we will find out in a minute. But it wasn't the only thing he discussed. Needless to say, that big bad, or that big white elephant in the room that everybody's talking about, and that would be Libra.
Certainly, arguably what kicked off so much of the conversation in 2019 about cryptocurrencies. The Chinese even reportedly pushed up their agenda for their own CBDC on the back of this Libra announcement. Libra has been a catalyst for much development in the sphere so far, at least a lot of noise. We'll see whether it actually turns into meaningful development. But Mnuchin made direct statements on how the U.S. government has moved forward, how the administration has moved forward with their approach to Libra. Let's take a listen.
First issue I want to talk about today is with regards to the new digital currency Libra that's being proposed by Facebook. We had Mr. Zuckerberg in here recently, and he explained his intentions and how this is all going to take place. Since then, China has made an announcement with regards to their own digital currency, and there's been some calls for the Fed to issue its own currency. And I'd just like for you to give us your position on it and where you see it going and what your thoughts may be on it, because it does seem to have some legs.
Sure. Well, let me just comment that when people talk about digital currencies, it's a large, vastly different area, and different sectors have different things. Specifically, as it relates to Libra, we've had probably a dozen meetings with Facebook. We've shared our concerns. It's part of the reason why they're slowing down their movement forward. We've discussed this at the G7 and the G20. I am fine if Facebook wants to get into digital payments. That's fine, and that may be good for their customer base and good for a lot of Americans who don't have access to banks. We want to make sure if they do it, they're doing it in a way that is fully compliant with our BSA, AML, and that in no way can this be used for terrorist financing and illicit activities.
Okay, interesting in many levels, although, you know, when you hear the end bit of it. First of all, this is, I think the tone on Libra is much nicer, quote unquote, than what we heard from Mnuchin back in July when the idea of Libra was announced.
Right. You know, back then.
Though he's being very specific.
Exactly. Yeah. Back then, he was calling Libra a danger to national security, wholesale, without a lot of the nuance that's entered the conversation. Now, as we just heard there, Mnuchin comes out saying he's fine if Facebook gets into digital payments, fairly amorphous term there, but that they need to...
it's a little condescending.
Perhaps so, but they need to comply with the BSA and AML standards of the US sort of laws and regulations. Pointedly, he said he's had dozens of meetings with leaders at Facebook. And again, by the way, point out, he's saying Facebook, not Libra. Kind of plays against the narrative that Facebook is trying to put out.
But what
they're
did
not
they
in
really
charge
expect?
of Libra.
I was about
Exactly.
to say. Okay, yeah.
So he said he's had dozens of meetings with Facebook, which arguably is probably slowing down a lot of the process of Libra. Remember, they were originally talking first half 2020 as their initial launch date. Right. It seems very unlikely. And ultimately, what's at stake here is this could end up watering down what Libra is considerably. Facebook and Libra as a whole have indicated in the past that they would be willing to pull back on some of their expectations, maybe more of a stable coin tied directly to the US dollar.
Well, according to the Secretary of Treasury, they just became a payment service.
Right. So exactly, could it be something as pulled back as a payment service? We'll end up with more of a PayPal, WeChat, Alipay style product than a true, digital currency in the form that they initially envisaged. But the fact that this conversation is being had, again, it's being brought back into the limelight by the Treasury Secretary. It's important this conversation is held out and played out, but interesting to see what's happening behind the doors in those meetings. I think we're going to find some interesting developments when Libra next makes it into the limelight. Which
will probably be at the turn of the new year, but that is around the corner.
It is.
Definitely. Asha Wasser-Prevens, thank you so much for shedding light on that. We were, of course, Cryptonomics on BLOCKTV. We'll be right back.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.